Welcome back, elegant decoys and quiet strategists. Those who learn that the smartest move is to fade while remaining fully present. You didn't disappear because you were weak. You stepped back because you understood something most people never do. There comes a moment when explaining yourself only feeds the very hands trying to control you. A moment when defending your truth turns into unpaid labor for people committed to misunderstanding it. You recognized that moment instantly, so you went quiet. Not out of fear, but out of awareness. You stopped performing clarity for people who thrived on distortion. You let them believe whatever version of you made them feel superior, safer, more in control. They mistook your silence for collapse. They assumed the absence of reaction meant surrender. They confused restraint with defeat, and that misunderstanding gave you exactly what you needed. Because when people believe you're broken, they relax. They stop filtering themselves. They grow careless, and carelessness reveals everything. Once you stopped pushing back, they leaned in. Their tone shifted. Their confidence grew. Accusations became bolder. Stories started changing depending on the audience. You noticed how easily facts bent when no one challenged them. How contradictions stacked up without shame. How yesterday's truth quietly disappeared to make room for today's version. And through all of it, you did the one thing they never expected. You watched. You saw how every insult carried a confession. How every attack mirrored something unresolved inside them. How the traits they accused you of surfaced most clearly when they thought no one was paying attention. You realized that people project hardest when they're terrified of being exposed. And in your silence, you were seeing everything. You didn't interrupt. You didn't correct the record. You didn't chase understanding from people invested in confusion. Instead, you let the pattern finish revealing itself. You let the lies overlap. You let the inconsistencies speak louder than you ever could. And with each contradiction, your clarity sharpened. There's a quiet power that arrives when you stop needing to be believed by those committed to misrepresenting you. When validation is no longer something you seek from the very source that distorts reality, something inside you settles, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. While they were busy rewriting narratives, you were building discernment. They grew uneasy when you didn't react, confused when you didn't defend yourself, restless when their words stopped landing. Your silence created a vacuum, and they rushed to fill it with noise. More messages, more messages, more messages. They escalated because chaos was the only language they knew how to speak fluently, and the louder they became, the clearer everything looked. You started recognizing the cycle, how provocation was used to regain control, how accusations replaced accountability, how they needed you emotionally destabilized to feel regulated themselves. And when you no longer gave them that, their behavior grew sloppier, louder, more desperate. Silence did what confrontation never could. It exposed them. You weren't collecting evidence to destroy anyone. That was never the goal. You were collecting understanding to protect yourself. You were learning how the game was played, so you'd never be trapped in it again. You saw who fed on reaction, who thrived on confusion, who needed you doubting yourself to feel secure. And that knowledge changed you. Something else happened during that quiet phase. You started noticing who stayed neutral while you were being misrepresented, who watched the spectacle without intervening, who only reached out when there was drama to consume and disappeared the moment healing began. That information rewired your boundaries permanently. You realize not everyone who smiles wants you well. Not everyone who listens cares. Not everyone who speaks loudly is telling the truth. Discernment replaced overgiving. Precision replaced panic. You became selective, not closed. Observant, not suspicious. Calm, not detached. And that balance made you untouchable in ways you hadn't fully grasped yet. They kept waiting for you to respond, to explain, to fight back, to exhaust yourself, trying to be understood. And when you didn't, something in their story fractured. Because without your participation, the narrative stopped working. Accusations need defense, manipulation needs resistance, control needs engagement, and you gave them none of it. Instead, you healed quietly, you stabilized, you reclaimed your inner ground piece by piece. And every step you took forward without them unsettled something deep in their system. Your peace became an accusation they couldn't answer. Your growth dismantled the illusion that you needed them. You didn't go silent to punish anyone. You went silent to save yourself, to preserve clarity, to step out of a dynamic designed to drain you. And in doing so, you didn't just survive, you evolved. With distance came vision, not the kind that blames or romanticizes the past, but the kind that sees structure. You began noticing patterns instead of moments, systems instead of isolated behavior. What once felt personal now revealed itself as procedural. The timing of their appearances, the way concern only surfaced when control felt threatened, the way kindness vanished the moment you stopped being useful. You saw it all without flinching. You stopped rushing to fix misunderstandings that were never misunderstandings to begin with. You stopped chasing closure from people who thrived on ambiguity. You understood that confusion wasn't accidental. It was engineered. And once that truth settled in, you no longer felt compelled to participate. Your nervous system recalibrated. The constant scanning, the hypervigilance, the instinct to explain yourself before being asked, all of it softened. You accepted that what you experienced was real, even if it had been denied, minimized, or reframed by others. That acceptance did something profound. It returned authority to you. You stopped outsourcing your reality. With that shift came a new kind of calm, not the fragile calm that depends on cooperation, but the grounded calm of someone who knows they can sit in discomfort without losing themselves. You were no longer afraid of being misunderstood. You were no longer destabilized by misrepresentation. You saw clearly now, people who want control will always rewrite those they can't contain, and you didn't need to correct a story you were no longer part of. Interactions began to feel different. You noticed how certain people hesitated around you, how familiar tactics lost their effect, how attempts to provoke you dissolved into awkwardness when you didn't take the bait. You weren't unkind, you were simply unavailable for manipulation, and that invisible boundary did more work than any confrontation ever could. You could sense when someone was fishing for a reaction, when they were testing whether the old axis still existed. You responded without responding. You answered without answering. You stayed neutral where chaos was expected, and that neutrality disarmed them completely, because chaos needs friction, drama needs energy, manipulation needs participation, and you withdrew yours. They couldn't escalate without exposing themselves. They couldn't accuse without sounding repetitive. They couldn't provoke without revealing intention. The entire structure collapsed under its own weight. You also stopped romanticizing being misunderstood. You didn't carry your pain as identity anymore. You didn't explain your history to earn empathy. You let people meet you where you were now. And if they couldn't, you didn't force compatibility. You understood something most people resist. Not everyone is meant to come with you into clarity. That realization brought discernment so precise it felt surgical. You noticed micro shifts in tone, pauses that didn't match the words, smiles that never reached the eyes. You didn't confront these things immediately. You logged them. You watched for consistency. You waited. Because patterns reveal intent far more accurately than moments ever could. And the truth is, you weren't angry. You weren't plotting. You weren't holding grudges. You were informed. Informed enough to choose distance. Informed enough to protect your peace. Informed enough to stop offering the benefit of the doubt to people who repeatedly showed you who they were. Something else changed too. Your understanding of closure. You realized closure doesn't come from conversation with someone who avoids accountability. It comes from naming what happened without minimizing it, from validating your own experience instead of waiting for someone else to confirm it. That's where your closure came from. Quietly, internally, permanently. There were moments when you caught yourself noticing how far you'd come, how something that once consumed you barely registered anymore, how people who once felt powerful now felt small, not because they changed, but because you did. Your center of gravity shifted, and when that happens, everything rearranges around it. You stopped explaining your boundaries. You enforced them through consistency. You stopped announcing your healing. You lived it. You stopped seeking justice through exposure. You trusted that patterns reveal themselves over time without your interference. And they always do. You became selective with access to your inner world. Not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. You finally grasped the cost of letting the wrong people in. You knew now that not everyone who listens is safe. Not everyone who empathizes is genuine. Not everyone who stays deserves to. And you were at peace with that. What unsettled them most was not your distance, but your consistency. You didn't oscillate. You didn't collapse in return. You didn't soften just enough to be pulled back in. You stayed steady. And that steadiness disrupted everything they relied on. Because the old dynamic required unpredictability, it needed emotional availability on demand. It needed you doubting yourself just long enough for them to regain leverage. And you no longer offered that opening. You didn't harden into bitterness. You didn't become cruel or defensive. You didn't mirror their tactics. You simply outgrew the entire structure. You became someone who could not be pulled into chaos because chaos no longer felt familiar, and familiarity had been their strongest hook. You noticed something quietly profound in the aftermath. The people aligned with truth felt calmer around you. They didn't need you to perform or explain. They didn't need you smaller, softer, or more accommodating. They met you without tension, without games, without subtext. Being around them felt like oxygen. That contrast taught you everything. It showed you that what you endured wasn't normal conflict or mutual misunderstanding. It wasn't a failure of communication. It was a system designed to destabilize you. And once you recognized that, you stopped internalizing it. You stopped carrying guilt that was never yours. You stopped apologizing for reactions that were responses to sustained pressure. Now, when someone twists your words, you don't scramble to clarify. You let the distortion sit. You watch how it lands. You observe who questions it and who accepts it without thought. That information tells you exactly where to place your trust. You don't need to interrogate loyalty. You let behavior answer for itself. You've become patient in a way that feels unsettling to people who expect urgency from you. You don't rush to respond. You don't rush to decide. You don't rush to correct. You understand that time exposes what arguments never can. Time reveals alignment. Time shows intent. Time separates truth from performance. And within that patience lives a quiet authority. Not dominance, not control. Authority over your inner state. Authority over what you allow to reach you. Authority over your narrative, even when others attempt to rewrite it. You no longer fear being mischaracterized because you understand something fundamental now. Character is revealed through consistency, not reputation. The people who matter will see. The people who don't were never your audience to begin with. This version of you doesn't announce boundaries. It embodies them. It doesn't threaten exits. It leaves. It doesn't argue with projections. It recognizes them. And recognition is enough. You've learned that not every truth needs to be spoken aloud. Some truths are meant to be lived. And living well, living clearly, living without entanglement in old dynamics is the most definitive statement you could ever make. They may still wonder about you, still speculate about your silence, still try to decode what you know, but you're no longer accessible to their curiosity. Observation no longer equals access. Distance no longer means absence. It means protection. You didn't just survive the dynamic. You transcended it. You took the lesson and left the battlefield entirely. You walked away with insight instead of wounds, clarity instead of confusion, sovereignty instead of fear. And that shift changed how you move through everything. You trust yourself now without qualifiers, without hesitation. You trust your memory. You trust your perception. You trust your instincts. That trust rewired you at a level most people never reach. Because once you stop doubting your inner compass, manipulation loses its entry point. This is the part few people talk about, the moment after clarity, when the noise fades and what's left is responsibility. Responsibility for how you choose, for what you tolerate, for what you no longer explain. And you've chosen differently. You choose environments that don't require armor, conversations that don't demand self-erasure, connections that don't thrive on confusion. You protect what you've earned, not aggressively but deliberately. You don't need to convince anyone of who you are. You let your life do that work quietly. This isn't the end of the story. It's the moment where it stops being reactive, where the narrative is no longer shaped by opposition, where what comes next has nothing to do with them at all. What comes next is built from discernment, from grounded awareness, from choices made without urgency or fear. It unfolds slowly, intentionally, on your terms, not as prey, not as predator, but as someone who sees clearly and owes no explanations. What comes after awareness is quieter than most people expect. There's no dramatic announcement, no visible transformation meant to be witnessed. The change happens internally, in how you move, how you decide, how you no longer negotiate with discomfort just to keep peace. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop offering context to those who only want leverage. And that restraint, that self-respect, settles into your nervous system like a new baseline. You begin to notice how little effort it takes now to remain steady. Situations that once pulled reactions out of you barely register. Comments that would have sent you spiraling past through without landing. Not because you've numbed yourself, but because you've recalibrated. You no longer take responsibility for managing other people's distortions. You understand that clarity doesn't require consensus. There's a freedom in that realization that's hard to describe until you live it. You no longer rush to close loops that were never meant to be closed. You don't chase explanations from people who benefit from ambiguity. You don't seek validation from spaces that thrived on your self-doubt. You let things remain unresolved when resolution would cost you your center. And that choice, repeated consistently, changes how others engage with you. Some drift away quietly. Some grow uncomfortable. Some test old boundaries just to see if they still exist, and you don't react to any of it. You observe, you note, you decide. Your responses are no longer automatic. They're intentional. And intention is what makes them powerful. You've also stopped narrating your healing. You don't need witnesses to your growth. You don't need acknowledgement for your restraint. You don't need apologies to move forward. You understand now that closure isn't something someone gives you. It's something you grant yourself when you stop waiting. There's a subtle confidence that comes with that. Not the performative kind, the grounded kind. The kind that shows up in how you hold eye contact, how you pause before speaking, how you don't fill silence just to ease tension. You let space exist. You let people reveal themselves without interference. And you trust what you see. You've become selective in ways that feel almost instinctive. You don't overextend. You don't overshare. You don't offer access prematurely. Not because you're guarded, but because you understand the value of discernment. You know that not everyone deserves proximity, and that truth no longer feels harsh. It feels accurate, and accuracy brings peace. You've learned that people who relied on your confusion struggle when you're clear, that those who fed on reaction falter when met with neutrality. That manipulation collapses when it can't provoke urgency. You don't need to confront these dynamics head on. You simply step out of them, and without your participation they dissolve on their own. What's different now is that you don't romanticize resilience. You don't glorify endurance. You don't mistake survival for success. You understand that strength isn't staying in harmful patterns longer. Strength is recognizing when something no longer aligns and having the courage to leave without burning everything down. You move forward without announcing your departure. There's a calm precision in how you live now. Your choices are cleaner, your words are fewer, your energy is protected. You don't engage in conversations that require you to betray yourself. You don't maintain connections that depend on you shrinking. And you don't explain these decisions because they're not up for debate. You've also made peace with being misunderstood by those who never wanted to understand you in the first place. You don't correct every false narrative. You don't chase every misrepresentation. You let time and consistency do what explanations never could. Because you know that truth doesn't need to shout, it holds. And the people who are meant to recognize it will. What remains now is sovereignty. Not control over others, but authority over yourself, over your attention, over your emotional bandwidth, over what you allow to influence your inner world. You've reclaimed that fully, and with it comes a sense of stability that isn't dependent on external conditions. You're no longer defined by what you endured. You're defined by what you chose afterward. You chose clarity over chaos, distance over dysfunction, peace over proving a point. And those choices compound quietly, shaping a life that feels grounded, intentional, and your own. This is where the story truly shifts, not in confrontation, not in vindication, but in embodiment, in living in a way that no longer requires explanation, defense, or permission. You didn't just expose the dynamic, you exited it with understanding intact. And from here on, everything you build is rooted in that knowing.